Welcome back, everyone. Next up is Bioxytran Inc. They're an OTCQB company trading under the ticker symbol BIXT. The company is a clinical stage biotech with 3 revolutionary platform technologies that were quickly developed using the power of AI. They have a broad spectrum oral antiviral drug that recently completed clinical trials and achieved 100% viral reduction in 7 days, a feat only accomplished by one other drug in the past decade. Their drug is a galectin inhibitor that not only neutralizes COVID-19, but also neutralizes influenza and RSV and prevents it from entering cells. They're currently recruiting patients for their dose optimization study, which will give them the ability to proceed with their registrational trial in India after they finish. They have a second platform drug being developed to treat stroke, which is supported by an FDA approval device that detects tissue oxygenation. And due to the molecule's small size, it has the ability to carry oxygen into areas of poor circulation. And there is a third platform technology that is capable of treating cancer metastasis. Well, Mike, you seem to be very busy and you want to do this Q&A type. I always enjoy speaking with you. So let's kick it off with some questions regarding your last press release on the universal oxygen carrier. Tell me about it.
Well, Anna, first, as always, I want to thank you for having us back and being part of this biotech conference. We find this is a wonderful platform for biotech companies to showcase their technology. So the universal oxygen carrier, first, let me explain what blood does before I get into that. You need this background. Blood not only carries oxygen from the lung to tissues in need, but it also carries essential nutrients like amino acids and glucose. Blood also removes waste products like urea and lactic acid, and then carries away the carbon dioxide. A universal oxygen carrier mimics just the oxygen transport function of red blood cells. See, what we do is we break up the red blood cells and we separate out and clean out everything but the heme. Now, this isn't a simple process, mind you. We have dozens of specially designed equipment that's needed to process the blood, along with 80 steps in the manufacturing process that ensures that we get a consistent product. This whole process is our intellectual property. This belongs to the shareholders. See, we're interested in just the heme component because that is the component that carries the oxygen. We don't really care about these globin chains. Now, once we have the heme concentrated, we combine it with our carbohydrate drug to form a heme carbohydrate complex that is basically an intravenous. Now, to help you visualize the product, it looks almost identical to what you would expect to see if you go into any hospital, you know, these little red blood cells hanging from IV bags. So that's what it looks like, and that is how it's administered. Now, let's do a deeper dive into the functionality of a universal oxygen carrier, okay? The size is thousands of times smaller than a red blood cell, and it's compatible for people in all blood groups. Another nice feature is the molecule stable at room temperature and doesn't need to be refrigerated and can last for up to 5 years.
Well, thank you for breaking that down for me. Now elaborate on some of the applications of the UOC and why it's so important.
Well, you know, the primary application is anytime a blood transfusion is needed. I'll give you a good example. There's a car crash, someone's bleeding, you need a transfusion, or any type of surgery where there's some sort of blood loss. Now, what I've just given you are like run-of-the-mill applications, but what I'd like to do is look outside the box at some of the other larger scale applications so you really understand the magnitude of what we're doing. What if there was a school shooting or, God forbid, domestic terrorism that results in a number of casualties? What are you going to do? We don't have time to conduct a blood drive or anything like that. people need to be treated right away. What about natural disasters like hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes? You know, these things have a tendency of cutting off your access to blood supply, especially if the refrigeration goes out. So I can see a number of scenarios where our universal oxygen carrier is actually stockpiled in strategic locations as a disaster preparedness measure. But now I want to be clear. This won't have any bottom line impacts on our financial statement. Let's talk about why this is so important. But Anna, I got a question for you. Do you think you can hold your breath while I give my answers?
No, not unless you want to see me turn red.
Of course
you have very long answers too.
Of course you can't, because that would put you into an extremely hypoxic state. So we got to talk about this word hypoxia and what it means so everyone understands just how important the concept is. When people die, it's because they're in a state of extreme hypoxia. The word is defined as a lack of oxygen to the brain. And actually, that is the true definition of death, is when the brain runs out of oxygen. Now, all people are born with their very own hypoxic curve that tells how well their body uses oxygen. Unfortunately, what happens is that this is a downward sloping curve right after birth and goes straight down to death. The fact is the better you manage oxygen, the longer you will live. Now, let that sink in for a second. The better you manage oxygen, the longer you will live. You want to be healthy? Manage your oxygen. You want to have less brain fog? Manage your oxygen. You want to have deep sleep? Manage your oxygen. Do you want to recover from exercise fast? Manage your oxygen. Now, hopefully I've emphasized the point. What do you want to do? Manage your oxygen.
I'm breathing deep over here.
Now, for some of the people out there where your oxygen curve is just a little bit challenged and you can only handle one tidbit of information, it's not to manage the oxygen. I have another point. The presence, and here, I'm going to bring this up here. I forgot the forward-looking statements. There it is. The presence of oxygen is the absence of disease. Let me say that again. The presence of oxygen is the absence of disease. So, did I basically just come on air and say, if you're properly oxygenated, you're not going to get sick? I kind of did. And there's a ton of science backing this up. You see, with every disease indication, there's this little tiny element, or sometimes big element, of hypoxia associated with the pathology. So if you value long and prosperous and healthy lifestyle, then what we're doing at Bioxytran should definitely perk your interest, and you should pay attention to the rest of this interview. So now, what I'd like to do is go into my oxygenation slides here. Hopefully everyone can see this. But what happens is, this is a picture of our oxygen bridge, BIXT 25. And you'll see we had to embellish it a little bit because the blue is not to scale. The blue represents our molecule, and this represents a cross-section of a clogged artery. And you can kind of see the blood cells are kind of getting stacked up, but the plasma, which contains our molecule, BXT25, it goes through. So it's 5,000 times smaller than a red blood cell, and it can be used in both ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke. That's our first and primary use. And you can see it can penetrate the clot and be there once administered within 3 minutes. And what the reason this is so important in stroke is it can reduce the time to needle. There's this tissue plasma administrate TPA that we give to people with strokes, but we only give it to them after imaging. So we're trying to reduce that time. We can get to it and give this to them ideally before they even have the imaging done. And that's what's so revolutionary about it. Now, the next slide, what I'd like to do is show you, I pass it up here, is what it is. So, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but this is the chemical structure heme, and that's where the molecule is attached, the oxygen molecule is attached. We can only deliver BXT25 as an IV. So I want to make this clear. This will never be some sort of pill that you take. BXT25 is always intravenous. It has to go into the vasculature. Like blood, it has to, it's a blood alternative, like same as that. And you'll see it's not immunogenic, means it doesn't interact with the immune system, and it's room temperatures and shelf stable. And we have it in liquid form, or it'll be longer in a dry powdered form. This is pretty much the end of my presentation. I'm going to leave perhaps this up. Oh, here. Okay. To remind people. Okay.
Thank you,
go
Mike.
ahead. Continue, Anna.
Well, when I heard you talk about some of the applications, my mind certainly went racing and my breath deepened. Obviously, there's so much going on. There's war raging in Israel, Ukraine, and I'm curious if the universal oxygen carrier can be used in the battlefield to save lives. So do you think there are military uses of this technology?
Yeah, Anna, I don't know if you realize it, but I'm a veteran. So if there's something to save lives, I'm all for it. Now, I've researched this topic, and the leading cause of death in battlefield is hemorrhaging. And when I mean leading, I mean 90%. The issue is that soldiers can't get replacement blood quick enough, which means these deaths fall in the, quote, potentially preventable death category. Now, if these soldiers were in a hospital setting, their lives could have been saved because they would have this immediate access to blood. What medics are armed with in the field right now is something called, these are Army field medics, is something called freeze-dried plasma. It's in a small little IV bag, and what they do is they kind of add some sterile water to it, they reconstitute it, they massage it a little bit, and then boom, it's ready to go to give to the soldier. Now, this freeze-dried plasma gives wounded soldiers just basically these clotting factors that they need to stop the bleeding. But what's missing? What's missing is the oxygen carrying capacity. Now, no one bothers to read our AKs, but I think by the stock price moving up, I think someone did. We mentioned that we're in the process of lyophilizing what's known as freeze-drying our universal oxygen carrier. Now, I can envision this product working side by side freeze-dried plasma. Once we prove that we can freeze dry and reconstitute our oxygen carrier, it's probably time to approach the military. I mean, what military wouldn't want something that's shelf stable for 5 years and turns into a universal oxygen carrier once it's reconstituted? This is almost like a no-brainer for the military. But why do we stop at the military? Why wouldn't civilian EMTs also want this? I don't know if you realize this, but almost no EMTs in ambulances carry blood, unless you're like in the whirlybird type, the helicopter EMTs. Now, this could be a very powerful tool for them too. The concept of how this could change emergency medicine is absolutely mind-boggling.
So, Mike, today you announced a joint venture with the Heme Foundation to fund the development of your universal oxygen carrier. Sounds like a no-brainer. Their mission is to address the global blood shortage, and they chose your technology. So congratulations, and give the investors a little color on how this joint venture came together.
Okay. The founders of the Heme Foundation basically have this belief that lack of access to blood is leading to millions of preventable deaths. And they just want to do something about it. Here's a mind-boggling stat for you. 200,000 women in Africa die during childbirth. And 70% of the time, the reason they die is because they couldn't get a blood transfusion. Now, this sort of death is tragic because it's preventable if we had the global will to invest in the infrastructure that's needed to expand the blood supply over there. Then we wouldn't have issues. This is where the Heme Foundation comes into play. There's a global shortage of blood supply, and the Heme Foundation was actually looking for a sustainable solution versus just throwing money into developing a blood supply chain from scratch. You might not realize it, but here in the United States, there's a shortage of blood. It's happening right now, and we have state-of-the-art technology. So you can see that it makes no sense to try to copy this model from the US and then transport it to Africa and expect better results. That's just not going to happen. Even with our resources in the United States, we still haven't solved the structural issues about blood supply. See, you can only have blood and keep it for 21 days. After that, it drastically reduces its ability to carry oxygen effectively. The blood also needs to be tested for pathogens to keep it safe while keeping it refrigerated. So the structural issue with keeping a blood supply chain and the constant replenishment cycle, that's still an issue. And in Africa, they need around 7 million transfusions annually, and only 50% of the people get them, which means millions of people aren't getting them and being put in harm's way because they can't get a transfusion. So the Heme Foundation was looking for a real solution, not just some sort of Band-Aid to save lives in the short run. They wanted a long-term sustainable solution, and a blood substitute just made the most sense. This is the primary reason that we are working together. Our technology would also enable large-scale manufacturing and stockpiling of the blood substitute at room temperature. The advantage of having a blood substitute versus donated blood is that there's no pathogens to screen for. No blood typing is needed before transfusion. Having a universal blood substitute that doesn't require cross-matching is actually a really big deal, because maybe people don't realize that there's 8 different blood types out there, and you'd have to inventory all of them to be prepared for what, in case someone gets hurt. So this is a logistical nightmare. This is why we think with the help of the Heme Foundation, we can actually solve the world's blood supply shortage with our blood substitute. This project wouldn't even exist without the Heme Foundation, because they don't have a profit motive that needs to be taken into consideration. It's impossible to make money on a product when the competition is just giving away the blood for free.
So if BIXT can't make any money on the UOC, how's it going to benefit from this joint venture?
That's a really good question. The core technology applies to both BXT25 and the universal oxygen carrier. The heme is actually the building block of BXT25 and the universal oxygen carrier. They're the same, which means we can use the same manufacturing process and plant. This will bring down our manufacturing costs in the long run. The MDX viewer is needed for the UOC as well as BXT25. So having this development completed benefits us when it comes time to do the clinical trial development. The toxicity studies in animals and humans are about the same, and the efficacy studies in humans are likely to kind of have the same similar protocols. So we actually derive a ton of benefit out of this JV relationship in terms of time to market and cost sharing. But our moneymaker is going to be BXT25. Remember earlier in my presentation, we talked about how every disease has a little teeny weeny bit of hypoxia associated with it. What this means is that we could have one of the largest platform technologies ever created. I seriously think we could be multiples of like Humira. That's one of the biggest ones right now. So we see a potential use case for BXT in almost every disease indication. And honestly, I think it might even work in Alzheimer's. Keep in mind, we have a number of journal articles that show a reversal of cognition with hyperbaric oxygen treatments. And our drug is basically HBOT on steroids. Then we have stroke and dementia and heart attacks. What do they all have in common? Blockage. Whether it's blockage of the blood flow to the brain, blockage of the blood flow to the heart, known as a heart attack, or these little tiny blockages in the little mini strokes that are symptomatic with dementia. There's actually so many case studies out there with HBOT treatment and how it helps diseases. BXT25 is basically HBOT in an intravenous shot. Now, HBOT is hyperbaric oxygen treatment is a $3.3 billion business out there in the United States alone. Now, and this is without insurance backing them. And we have a disruptive technology that could make them obsolete. So I want investors out there to ask yourself, does a $20 million market cap make sense for a company that has all this? And then let me add on, what about sickle cell anemia? Patients' blood clots, and remember what I told you is our oxygenation helps go through clots. So it can help those people in need. And let's not forget about cancer. Cancer hides from the immune attack by creating this little hypoxic region that it lives in. What happens when oxygen comes in and lights it up? The immune system attacks it and gets rid of it. So we see lots of opportunity here with BXT25.
So where is the money coming from to bring it through clinical trials? We have a pledge for 10 million, but it's going to take at least 20 million?
The Heme Foundation made a pledge to basically do the heavy lifting on the financing. While the pledge is only for 10 million, there's no reason why they couldn't continue funding the project to completion. But our plan is a little bit different. We want to pursue grant funding for the balance. We think the DoD and the WHO are going to be extremely interested after we do our proof of concept. And I think it's reasonable to think that these organizations are just going to take the ball and run with it, which means we're not going to be on the hook for doing the clinical trials. So now I want to be clear, BIXT is not interested in commercializing this product. The risks are just way too high as a blood substitute for a company our size. Think about, again, we have to compete with people that give away their bodily fluids for free. There's no business opportunity there.
So why is it going to take 3 to 5 years to develop this product, given that the manufacturing is already complete?
We're currently, here's the thing that I'd like to clear up. We're currently on year 2 of the development plan. Now, drug development, so this is where I got to bring investors' expectations back into reality here. Drug development is slow, and very few drugs are developed in 3 years. In fact, the average drug development time is 12 years, requires over $1 billion of financing, maybe $2 billion, okay? We finished our first year, so we feel our develop is actually on an accelerated trajectory. The other thing to consider is that we need the MDX viewer for clinical trials, and that can be worked in parallel with their animal studies, but it's going to take a year minimum. See, without the MDX viewer, it's going to take more time and money. We'd almost need 4 times the number of people in the trials to prove our endpoint. So the MDX is going to instantly tell us whether the oxygenation is being absorbed in the tissue, proving whether our universal oxygen carrier is actually transporting the oxygen. So this is actually the most efficient clinical trial development pathway.
And so how does a UOC compare to other hemoglobin-based oxygen carriers?
We have a carbohydrate molecule. That's the primary difference. Other HBOCs use nanoparticles and encapsulation tricks to transport the oxygen. These other HBOCs have side effects like increased blood pressure, organ damage. so the addition of our carbohydrate to the heme molecule has shown in animal studies that it prevents these sort of side effects. I don't want to get too far in the weeds of the science, but our heme carbohydrate complex is a true oxygen carrier versus some of the other technologies out there. Now, hyperbaric oxygen treatment is another treatment worthy of comparison that I want to get into, but it doesn't have the side effects and prevents people from having more than an hour of treatment daily. Many might not know, but how hyperbaric chambers work. So I want to give a quick tutorial. 98% of our blood carries oxygen. The other 2% dissolves in the blood plasma. So what we have here is we have, when you go on oxygen, you get 5 times the amount. So that 2% goes to 10%, right? Now, if you go into hyperbaric chamber, instead of getting 10%, you get 20% at 2 atmospheres, okay? And that's kind of how the math works. And the idea behind it is that since it's dissolved in the blood plasma, it's going to go into these nooks and crannies and crevices where blood doesn't go and get rid of that hypoxia that's out there. Now, there's a lot of research that shows the benefit of HBOT, but one just stands out that I got to tell you about. There's this lady that had progressive Alzheimer's disease for 5 years, and she did a couple months of treatment. And what happened? Her cognitive function increased, didn't remain the same. It actually increased. And then what happened? She got off of it because everyone has to get off of it for a while. And then it declined, and then got right back on it. And what happened? You guessed it, it increased again. So now, if you're wondering why people aren't just rushing out to go do HBOT treatment because it works on all these little indications, or actually big indications, is because you got to go there, you got to get ready. It's a travel time. It's sitting in this bubble for a while, and it's not palatable. Versus what we have, you get an IV dose of it, and our half-life is 18 hours. So one treatment is equivalent to 18 hours of HBOT treatment. You can only get 1 hour treatment of HBOT versus 18 hours. We don't even know what can happen. So this is why we need investor support so that we can bring this to market.
And so I recall might be the last question due to time, but we'll see. There's a significant part of your strategy, Mike, pursuing these JV type relationships. So give the investors an update on any progress you've made recently beyond the Heme Foundation.
I think we mentioned that we contracted a licensing specialist to help package ourselves to small and big pharma names. He's basically in the process of scheduling calls with his existing relationships. And I can tell you, we're very pleased with the caliber of companies that he has brought to us. And what we also did is we prioritized this list. So we're basically going after low-hanging fruit. And the other thing that we have is we have our data room ready for these serious inquiries. And we've also streamlined our presentation decks. So after we reviewed everything, we are going to focus on dermatology and broad spectrum antivirals. And we're also in the process of completing our science deck in cancer to take advantage of this relationship that he has in oncology. So it's a long process. We're in the thick of it, and we're feeling extremely optimistic. And we're looking forward to more JVs in the future.
Wonderful, Mike. Well, give us some closing remarks. This was, as always, a really fascinating presentation, and I always take away something to learn about the human body. So what are your closing remarks today?
I want to talk about galectin science. There's some significant readouts happening in the latter half of this year. And I think they're going to light our sector on fire just the same way as these GLP-1 inhibitors have, lit on fire, and all the investors are going after these fat-busting type drugs. So I really feel that there's a readout on where galectin inhibitor is being used in NASH, And I think that's going to filter and raise this whole sector of galectin science. Do I think it's going to rise the level of GLP-1 inhibitors? I don't know, but I think that's a catalyst that investors really need to look at coming in the future. I'm just assuming, let's say we do absolutely nothing, what's going to happen? If there's a good readout there, all these big pharmas are going to ask this question, who's next?
There you go. That's a great way to end. We appreciate your time and expertise in this field, and we look forward to having you on again in the future. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Anna.
All right, everyone. We'll be right back with our next presenter.